Hello, everyone. It's time for the early part of the Cold War. And the Cold War begins the very day the Second World War ends. Yes, are we headed for World War III? You kind of know the answer already. But hey, we're going to pretend we don't know. So it all really starts with the Soviet view of the Cold War because a lot different than the American view. And it comes down to Poland. What's Poland? What's that all about? Well, if you ask us, we say Poland was occupied by the Germans and now the Russians, and it's time to establish a free country in Poland, to which the Russians agree. Certainly, multi-party elections are great. They have a choice between the Communist Workers' Party and the Communist Workers' Party. Why are they so like this? Because Russia, if you know anything about Russian history, and I'm sure you do, especially if you took my World One class, is because Russia has had a history of being invaded many, many times from this direction. 1600s it was Poland, 1700s Sweden, 1800s France. Germany's come after them twice in the 20th century. The second one was really bad. So they want to make sure this doesn't happen again. This is kind of like saying Colombia marches up to Mexico and destroys LA. Not that that would be a bad thing, but nonetheless, we're going to make sure nobody comes up to Mexico to ever attack us again. So the Russians see Poland the same way. Poland is not only a question of honor for Russia, but one of life and death. Joseph Stalin, as you've probably guessed, is a somewhat intense kind of guy. So here's the Cold War starting lineup. You can see where the Soviet Union is, and you can see how far to the west they have pushed. They're determined that if an attack comes from the west again, it doesn't start from here, doesn't start from there, not even here. They have to start all the way here before they come anywhere near the Soviet border. Meanwhile, they've also got huge armies still sitting in Eastern Europe. Naturally, people in Western Europe are a little bit nervous about this huge Soviet force sitting right across the border. So they begin to form their own alliance called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We've got West Germany, which gets admitted in 1955, but everybody's got their soldiers there. We've got Norway, Britain, France, the Low Countries. Italy joins up. We got Portugal. Spain's officially 1982, but their Navy been working with us anyway. Later on, Greece and Turkey are going to join in 1948. So the Russians see it as a alliance that could come after them. So that's why they've occupied Eastern Europe and got tons of soldiers and tanks and artillery and everything. And Western Europe looks across the border and they see a bunch of Soviet soldiers looking right back at them. Wow, that makes everybody feel great, doesn't it? The Iron Curtain speech, Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, in February of 1946. Winston Churchill, the guest of honor. Remember when they used to congratulate the graduates and say good luck? He decides to give a foreign policy speech and states that an Iron Curtain has fallen across half of Europe. That's where we get the term Iron Curtain. Is this a declaration of World War III? Certainly sounds like it. Hey, by the way, 6 million Polish American voters in the middle of an election year coming up. Oh, what a shock. Let's get somebody and scare everybody and focus on a foreign enemy. Yep, politics, politics, more politics. Here's the Iron Curtain he was talking about. Nothing's going to get over this border. Finnish Soviet border, nothing gets through. Here we are between East and West Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all this stuff. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out unless it's supervised and everything. Here's West Berlin and East Berlin. They've got a land bridge and an air bridge you're allowed to go through, but don't step a single foot the other side because you know how paranoid the Russians are about stuff like this. And yeah, they might actually shoot you. Well, you're an American, probably not. But do you really want to take a chance with these guys? As you've guessed, they're paranoid and very well armed. George F. Kennan's the architect of a policy we're going to call containment. Here's the official definition. Containment, the U.S. grand strategy for the Cold War, a long-term plan uniting military, economic, and diplomatic efforts to contain communist expansion until internal contradictions in the Soviet system bring about changes, i.e., collapse. George Kennan, who died in 2010, you can see he's been around a while. Um, he realizes what the Soviet Union is all about. He says basically we're going to build a fence around the Soviet Union and keep it from taking over other countries and turning them communist. The Soviet Union sees taking over other countries and turning it communist as kind of creating a bigger buffer between them and any potential invader. Of course, the United States sees this as Soviet imperialism, and the Soviet Union sees American attempts at stopping this as American imperialism, which means we get into competition with the Soviet Union for allies all over the world, and both sides end up doing stuff they really aren't proud of. So, containment, the U.S. strategy for the Cold War, United States, Soviet Union hasn't gone hot, because if it does, no one's going to live through it. This is the strategy to try and build a fence around the Soviet Union until, the internal contradictions bring about some kind of a change. Eventually it will work, because you look at the map, you see Russia, you don't see the Soviet Union, right? 1991. So, like we're talking about two different views of the world. Here's the Soviet view, where they see the entire world coming after them. The Americans over here, Western Europe, Israeli aggressions, Pakistan tied there with the U.S., China, Japan, and they see themselves as surrounded by this menacing Uncle Sam. Meanwhile, we take a look at this and we see the Soviet Union in a central position with a history of imperialism, can attack in any direction, and now we're the ones scared of them. It's like one of my students once said, the Cold War is basically two people pointing at each other in the mirror. So who's the aggressor and who's the victim? Depends who you ask, man. You get different questions when you ask different people. Now, we're prepping for this over on the domestic side. We got the National Security Act of 1947. We bring all the armed forces combined into the Defense Department. Instead of the Department of War, now it's the Department of Defense, because it's good PR, right? You don't sound so aggressive. The Central Intelligence Agency is established. These are all the spies and the intelligence network. Try to find out what's going on in the Soviet Union. And believe me, that's not easy. National Security Council brings everybody together. Joint Chiefs, the CIA, Vice, everybody. We try to talk about national security and how to defend the country. Got all these tons of alphabet soup agencies start showing up too. The Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency. Sometimes these guys get just as paranoid as the Russians. Get combined with what I call the IRW, idiots running wild, because where McCarthyism comes from, where everybody was pointing and accusing people of being a communist, even though you had no evidence, end up in trial, and the whole thing went crazy from there. Here's the Truman Doctrine. Oops, I have my picture of Harry Truman. Well, you know what he looks like, so let's not worry about it. So, Greece and Turkey have a bit of a communist problem over here. Yep, they've got communist insurgents. Great Britain is trying to support both of these countries to keep them from going communist. Turns out Britain's broke. You fought two world wars, you got other colonial problems. Hey, Greece and Turkey, you don't even own those places. So they're going to say basically it's not our problem anymore. So the United States has to step into the gap. And we sent $400 million worth of aid to Greece and Turkey to keep communist revolutionaries from overthrowing their government. And here we are, the Truman Doctrine. The United States will try. If for 400 million bucks, you better do more than try, pal. Start over. The United States will try to support any free people resisting attack and subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Translation: I don't need the Communist Workers' Party overthrowing some government and suddenly becoming buddies with the Russians and then moving on to the next country. That's what we're trying to stop. The Soviet Union sees overthrowing a country on their border and going communist as pushing their defensive perimeter further out. We see that fence coming towards us. Here's the problem: U.S. and Soviet tendencies to try and keep the other guy from expanding, which leads to more and more anger. Also remember, we have an atomic bomb. The Soviet Union does not. They finally get one in 1949. Now we've got a possibility of World War III going nuclear. So at some point, Joseph Stalin decides to test U.S. resolve. Western resolve, certainly, but everybody knows the U.S. is kind of carrying the whole thing over here. So he decides to lock down Berlin. Remember, it got a road that leads there. We're allowed to use it. Got an air corridor we can fly stuff into. And the Soviet Union declares that Berlin, West Berlin, is not going to be resupplied. Cannot use the road to bring supplies in. That's a bit of a problem. Now the problem is Buddy the cat. Say hi, Buddy. All right, see you. Go around, Buddy. So the problem with this is that the city of Berlin, with over 2 million people, requires close to 3 million tons of supplies a day. It's easier to truck it in than to fly it, but they won't let you truck it in. So here's your problem. Do you declare war and attack East Germany to force your way to Berlin? Or do you just fly over them? And they decide to fly over them. They're not going to get all the supplies that they need, but they're figuring to get enough. And the Soviet Union really doesn't know what to do because now the Russians have a problem. American planes are flying by, and what are you going to do? Shoot them down? Yeah, if you shoot down an American plane, you're at war with the United States. Remember, they've got an atomic bomb. You're still working on yours. And even if this thing was conventional, granted the Russians may have a bigger army, but you know how Americans are with fighting. Think twice about fighting with the U.S. Army. Eventually, Stalin has to back down in 1949, opens up the roads and all the air corridors again with no harassing Soviet planes. And Stalin is very upset because somebody, i.e., Harry Truman, has stared him down. So we figure there's all kinds of problems in Europe, right? Because they've been destroyed by the war, no industry, no jobs. When this kind of thing happens, communism starts to, look attractive. So we decide we're going to do what is basically, the New Deal, this time in Europe. It's the Marshall Plan, or as the European Recovery Plan, 1947. We'd given a $3.5 billion loan to Great Britain in 1946. The Soviet Union asked for a loan, we wouldn't give it to them. So all right, just more and more anger between us and the Soviet Union. Eventually, a $13 billion plan goes to Europe. It's $130 billion in today's money to build new factories. If you got factories, people have jobs. If they have jobs, they produce stuff. Because you have jobs, you have money. Now they can buy the stuff they're producing. So by 1952, Western Europe's industrial production is something like 200% up because they're starting from the bottom. And nobody's looking at communism because everybody's got food and a job. So North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we talked about that earlier, right? Started off originally with these countries in the dark. Norway, Iceland, Greenland technically, because it's part of Denmark who joined. We got the Netherlands, we got Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Britain, Italy, Portugal, Spain, they're officially in 1982, but their navy been training with us all this time. And after the communist revolts have been crushed in Greece and Turkey, they join. This stuff comes later. So this is a defensive alignment against Soviet aggression, i.e., these 500,000 some odd Soviet troops, tanks, planes, artillery sitting in Eastern Europe pointed west. So we see it as defense, and we think the Soviet Union is about to attack. The Soviet Union regards their setup as defensive, and they're not exactly thrilled about seeing NATO. Yeah, their view of NATO is somewhat different. Why is this? Again, remember how many times Russia has been invaded from that very same direction. National Security Paper 68, NSC 68, produced in April of 1950. It's 58 pages long. I know this because I had to read this thing and I had to write 2 or 3 papers about it. So I'm just going to summarize it for you. Remember containment? Well, here it is, explained in 58 long pages. It's the fundamental paper describing the U.S. view of the Cold War. They see this as a military confrontation. They emphasize Soviet military aggression, territorial greed, and world domination. How does the Soviet Union see this? Just change Soviet for U.S. And now you see the problem. The Russians see us as the aggressor. We see the Russians as the aggressor. Who's right? Who's wrong? Remember what I said earlier. It's like pointing in a mirror, right? Pointing right back at you. Oops, let's try this map out instead. Let's check out Asia. Now, after Berlin, which was the first test of the Cold War, we got another one coming up, and Soviet Union really wasn't behind this one. It sort of happened on its own, but they had no problem sending aid. As you know, the Soviet Union was communist. Mongolia had been a Soviet state since 1921, puppet state, I should say. China had a civil war that had broken loose from 1927 between the nationalists, right? Sort of democracy, and communists, Mao Zedong and all these guys. They'd fought each other all the way across China from 1927 to 1937. They called a ceasefire so both could unite to fight against the Japanese. And when the Japanese were defeated in 1945, communists and nationalists go back after each other again. In 1949, the communists win. And the nationalists escape over here to Taiwan, where they are to this day, nationalist China, or some people just call it Taiwan or even Chinese Taipei. People's Republic of China, i.e. China, is communist, very large, and has a very big army that has a lot of experience. Now, when the Second World War ended, Korea was split in half. because the Japanese were surrendering. So the Americans had occupied Japan, and we're going to occupy the south side of Korea to disarm Japanese soldiers there. And the Russians, who had invaded Manchuria against the Japanese, were going to take the north side of Korea to disarm the Japanese north of that line. And of course, after they were disarmed, everybody goes home, except the Russians didn't go home, right? They stay there and they establish another communist government. 1948, North Korea becomes a communist country. South Korea becomes sort of democratic with some dictatorial tendencies. But hey, they're not communists, so we're kind of okay with this. Now, North Korea, then, just like now, is kind of run by crazies. It just has a tendency to do it at once. Sometimes it listens to the Soviet Union, sometimes it doesn't. China, of course, became communist in 1949, so North Korea is backed by both China and the Soviet Union. And without telling anybody, including the Russians, because Joseph Stalin didn't even know about this, we learned later, they decide to invade South Korea. We've got the Korean War. Some people think World War III has started in Korea. It certainly appears that way, but like I said, even the Russians were a little bit surprised by this. They didn't give a go-ahead or anything, so North Korea goes on the attack. North Korea has a very good army. It's Soviet weaponry, Soviet training, the whole thing. South Korea basically has nothing. And as you can tell, South Korea almost loses the war. We send some American soldiers in, try and stop them. Of course, these guys are, they've been out of training, they're out of shape, they've been occupation duty in Japan, and get pushed down to this corner. We send Doug MacArthur. He lands over here at Incheon, takes Seoul, cuts off the North Koreans, and crushes them. American air power comes in handy because North Korea has a small air force, but it basically gets blown out of the sky. Some Soviet pilots there, but hey, you knew the risk. And we start pushing. We drive him out of South Korea, and our UN mandate was to save South Korea, so it's been saved. But MacArthur decides best way to save South Korea is totally crush North Korea, and in he goes. And you can see he comes really close. But now he gets this warning from China not to get too close to the border. MacArthur, who sees himself as, you ready for this, quote, an expert on the Oriental mind, completely misreads the situation, somehow does not notice 300,000 Chinese coming over the border, and they smash headfirst into us, driving us backwards. We threaten to use the atomic bomb on the Chinese. The Chinese say, quote, so we lose a million or two, end quote. Yeah, this tells you the kind of enemy you're dealing with here. Well, MacArthur threatens to use the A-bomb anyway. He gets fired. We bring in Ridgway. They drive us back a bit, but that's okay because here comes the air power, destroy the supply lines. We start pushing them back. Now, instead of getting caught in this endless tug of war back and forth with China over North Korea, or as Omar Bradley said, you're fighting the wrong enemy in the wrong war in the wrong place, the wrong time. Note the word wrong showing up over and over. We decide that we're going to have just a permanent ceasefire in Korea, and there they are, this day, glowering at each other over the border, though we may have made a little bit of diplomatic headway, lately with President Trump trying to talk to North Korea, which is, considering it's North Korea, it's about as good as it can get, I guess. North Korea today. Did we win? Yeah, there's still a South Korea, a little bit bigger. We took some territory. We certainly didn't lose. We accomplished our objective. Of course, China's view is they wanted to save North Korea, and they accomplished their objective. So to this day, still divided. North Korea still crazy. North Korea has nuclear weapons too. If we can just keep talking to them, it's a lot better than fighting with them, right? All right, U.S. presidents, Soviet premiers early here in the Cold War. Something I want you to take a look at here. Now, Truman, he stepped down in 1952, and now we got Eisenhower and everybody behind him. There's Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, everybody. And over here, Soviet premiers. Take a look at these numbers. Might want to take a picture, write them down. All right, what do you notice here? If you take a look over to the U.S. side, you see it's fairly regular. It's every 4 or 8 years. Kennedy got shot here, so it's a little bit off. But look, one right behind the other. Nixon had to resign, but, one right behind the other. No gaps, very predictable, very stable. Now, over in the Soviet Union, if you notice, yeah, it's not very uniform, right? They're here for a long time. And in fact, there's even a gap here between 53 and 56. After Stalin died, they weren't sure who their leader was going to be until Khrushchev finally came up on top. And you can tell they're kind of there for life. And, different length of time, and each guy is a little bit different. American policy is fairly consistent. Some people more aggressive than others, but still fairly consistent. Containment. Over here, different man, different policies. Depends who's in charge. Stalin, very confrontational. Khrushchev tries to push the wall a couple times. It doesn't happen. He fails. He's going to get fired, basically. Brezhnev right here, he's basically a bureaucrat and a paper shuffler. He's happy to keep things calm. U.S.-Soviet relations are very calm during this time. What do you notice here with Andropov and Chernenko? Yeah, they're not around very long, are they? Because the one thing about the Soviet Union was that, well, communism just doesn't work. I mean, the Soviet Union will collapse, like Kennan said it would. It took a while, but it finally did. The Soviet system here in the 80s is sick and literally dying on everybody. So Gorbachev, a young man of 65, shows up here in 1985 with perestroika and glasnost trying to, quote unquote, reform the Soviet system, but it's not going to work because the Soviet Union will collapse in 1991. So containment ends up working because the Soviet Union simply was never going to work. Communism simply doesn't work. Now, communism, clearly an economic and political failure, but they're good with science. I got to give them that. First object into space is Sputnik back in 1957. Caused a lot of panic because you can launch a small satellite, you can launch a nuclear weapon into space. First man into space is Yuri Gagarin, another Soviet technological triumph. But you know what? The Russians may have got those first two achievements. We got the one that matters. Here we are. We got to the moon. Whose flag is that? America, USA, USA. Don't see any Soviet flags there, do you? Now, I mentioned earlier the Cold War involves competition for allies. Both sides kind of do things they're not very proud of. And there's tons of examples. And here's one for you now. Iran in 1953. We got a prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who wanted to pull away from the West all over oil. And we weren't sure, and he had some socialist tendencies, so automatically everybody assumed he was a communist. So the CIA overthrew him and put in the new king, Shah of Iran. That's going to come back to bite us in 1979. So is that American involvement in another country, overthrowing the government? Yeah, it is. Would we ordinarily do that? Probably not. But, when you're so terrified of communism, the ends justify the means kind of thing starts popping up into your thinking. Here we are at the Suez Crisis in 1956. Great Britain, France, and Israel are trying to take over the Suez Canal and overthrow the Egyptian government. Ordinarily, we don't do stuff like this, but, they went and did it anyway, and we had to yank the chain there on France and Britain and forced them to give everything back. At the same time, in Hungary in 1956, we got an attempted revolt against the Soviet Union. Hungary decides that it wants communism, and the entire Hungarian army tries to pull the country out of the Soviet orbit, and it doesn't work. So France and Britain are our allies, but they're doing stuff we don't want them to do because we're doing stuff we normally wouldn't do. And the Soviet Union, you look at the Iron Curtain, think everything's calm. Nope, there's a lot of stuff going on back there. And even inside the Soviet Union, you got some problems because in 1956, we got a Soviet army sit-down strike in Siberia. Yeah, I guess somebody got tired of walking around out in that snow all day, and they decided one day they weren't running a patrol, and everything kind of went crazy. It's one thing to yell at strikers in Poland. It's another thing to talk to a Soviet tank division who decides they don't want to go somewhere. We know about this because they try to make radio contact with a ham radio with the U.S. Army in Japan. As you can imagine, the Russians shut that down really fast. And instead of shooting everybody, I think the Russians just kind of broke up the unit and redid their training schedule. Because, like I said, it's one thing to shout at workers in foreign armies. It's another thing when your own army turns a gun on you. Now, here's the Congo crisis. Why is this important? Because the competition for allies between the United States and Soviet Union is worldwide and goes to every single corner of the globe. It is all encompassing and seen as a zero-sum game. If this guy's not on our side, he must be on their side. Of course, some people just want to be neutral, and if you live in the Congo, you figure you're far away from both of them. But guess what? The Cold War's coming to you. Now, here's this guy named Patrice Lumumba. He had some socialist tendencies, obviously. Congo was a Belgian colony. In the 1960s, they gave it its independence because Belgium was grossly mismanaging it, and yeah, maybe it's time for colonialism to end. Now, the Congo itself, kind of in the middle of nowhere, no one could really care if it went communist, capitalist, or worshiped the flying spaghetti monster. But see this thing down here called Katanga? Oil, tin, gold, every kind of mineral you want, and suddenly everybody's interested in the Congo. Suddenly, the Western allies and the United States and the Soviet Union send in advisors and people, and suddenly everybody's interested in the Congo. They haven't been interested before, they haven't been interested since. But hey, it's the middle of the Cold War, and suddenly this thing is in play. Patrice Lumumba tried to set up a somewhat socialist government, which isn't communist, but like I said, it's the Cold War. He gets killed, and they set up their own dictator who is pro-Western. Again, we're not very fond of dictators, but he's not communist, so he's okay. Cold War. So paranoid, we do stuff we ordinarily don't like to do. Hey, here's the Berlin Wall. Well, not really, that's from Lord of the Rings. They're a little bit more accurate. The Berlin Wall. Now, so many people were leaving East Germany, they had what they called a brain drain. Usually, when you build a fence, you're trying to keep people out. The Berlin Wall is unique in the fact that it was trying to keep people in. And nothing, and the only time I've ever seen a place where they build a fence to keep people in is a prison. And that's what they've turned East Germany and the Iron Curtain into, one big prison. So nothing says communism is a failure like a wall to keep people in. And look at this thing, man. Good luck trying to cross that. Not to mention, got people with machine guns and stuff up there. Now, this thing didn't just show up overnight. Pretty close, forced labor and people with, rifles pointed at you. It does miracles for productivity. But not everyone was happy about it. And as you can see, this East German soldier is making a run for it before the thing becomes an actual wall. Starts off with barbed wire and then comes the wall. And here's an East German soldier who's helping a kid get over there. So not everybody on the East Side is a heartless Terminator type of guy. They're quite human as well. And he's probably going to cut his fingers picking that up. But hey, you're helping a kid out, so that's okay. So a lot of times there's a tendency of the Soviet Union to dehumanize Americans, and of course an American tendency to dehumanize the Soviet Union because of this intense dislike for each other in the Cold War. And the only reason they didn't actually end up fighting each other is because both sides had nuclear weapons. You think twice about fighting somebody who's got nukes. Which brings us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the time, today, we could launch a missile from the Midwest and hit anything on the planet, maximum of 30 minutes. If it's closer, less than 30 minutes. So the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba. We're going to talk about Cuba later, but Cuba had gone communist under Fidel Castro. There was a dictator named Batista running it with a communist revolt. We don't like communists, so we end up supporting a dictator named Batista, something we ordinarily wouldn't do, but he's fighting communists, right? Well, Castro will overthrow the Batista dictatorship, and Cuba becomes communist and becomes allied to the Soviet Union. Look how close this thing is. So the Soviet Union in 1962 put nuclear weapons in Cuba, and we've got ourselves another confrontation. We had sort of a confrontation over the Berlin Wall, but nothing happened because they're building it in their own territory. But for some reason, Khrushchev had interpreted Kennedy's response as weak, so now he's going to push the nukes on our front doorstep. So if they ever decide to launch the nukes, there's really nothing we could do to stop them. So we got to stop it before it becomes a problem, and that's where we put not a blockade around Cuba, but a quarantine to keep any more Soviet aid from coming to Cuba. And of course, the Soviet Union is very far away, and we're very, very close. So the Soviet Union is going to have to back down on this. And of course, we had nuclear weapons in Turkey at the time. So the Soviet Union was actually trying to force us into a deal. And they asked, if you remove the missiles from Turkey, we'll remove our missiles from Cuba, and you promise not to invade Cuba. So that was the deal we made, and the Cuban Missile Crisis comes very close to a nuclear war, but it doesn't. And how do we know this? Two reasons, my friend. One, this conversation's actually happening, and two, you're taking Mr. H's World History 2 class. That's the early part of the Cold War. Went on there close to half an hour, so I'm going to give you guys a break, some time to digest that, and you go out there and have yourself a great day.